Sandy Hervieux et Robin Canuel nous présenteront les étapes qui ont été entreprises pour optimiser le service virtuel de référence pour offrir un support optimal à la recherche, l'enseignement et l'apprentissage durant cette pandémie. Sandy est la coordonnatrice de la référence virtuelle de la bibliothèque de l'Université McGill, où elle est aussi bibliothécaire de liaison pour les sciences politiques, la philosophie et l'école d'études religieuses. Ses intérêts de recherche portent principalement sur les services de référence, les compétences informationnelles et l'impact de l'intelligence artificielle sur les services en bibliothèque. Robin est bibliothécaire en chef, University Librarian, de l'Université Lakehead à Thunder Bay en Ontario. Il s'intéresse aux compétences informationnelles, à l'utilisation de tablettes pour l'enseignement et la recherche, et le développement des services et de l'évaluation en bibliothèque académique.
Hi, my name is Sandy, and I'm the Virtual Reference Coordinator at McGill University. Welcome to this presentation, where we're going to talk about providing virtual reference services during a global pandemic, leveraging an existing library service during challenging times. So I made this presentation with my co-presenter, Robin Canuel, who's currently the University Librarian at Lakehead University, who unfortunately could not be here today. So here's a look at what we're going to talk about today. So first, we'll just do a quick overview of what the service was actually like pre-pandemic. And then we'll talk about some of the ways that we actually tried to optimize the virtual reference service during the pandemic. Because as you can imagine, we received a lot more requests than we normally would, and they were somewhat different to what we usually get. So we'll go through how we adapted the hours, the staffing of the service, and some little tools that we created to make it easier for the operators of the system, so usually librarians, who offered virtual references. So some of the tools that we gave them to make it easier for them to do their jobs. And we'll give you a brief overview of some of the numbers and types of questions that we received during the pandemic. And those are quite interesting, especially if we compare them to what we usually get. And then we'll wrap it up with some of the next steps that we plan to do to continue to optimize the service as the pandemic is sadly still going on, and some of the ways that we're going to assess what we've been doing. So first off, an overview of our regular virtual reference service. So we usually provide live chat with a librarian during our opening hours, and also email support. So people can email their questions, and then it goes through the virtual reference platforms, and librarians would answer usually within a 24-hour turnaround time. So when librarians are scheduled, they're primarily doing chat, and then when they're not receiving chats, they will answer emails and also text messages. So this has been going on for a few years now that we receive texts, and they usually tend to be short interactions, right? You may not ask a very in-depth reference question over text, right? That's not how people tend to use it. So usually if it's during our opening hours, it will come in on our chat platform, so it will be very live and quick. And then if it's outside the hours, the patron or the user will get an automated message saying that it's closed and will follow up once it's open. That's important to know because sometimes libraries will offer just chat on their virtual reference platform and answer most of their email through the library email, for example. But for us, it's all integrated into one platform, which makes it really interesting because we get a full view of some of the questions that we get. So the platform that we use, we started using LibAnswers by SpringShare in August 2019. Previous to that, we were using QuestionPoint, but QuestionPoint stopped actually providing their platform, so we switched over to LibAnswers. And it enables chat, email, and text reference. And we've been doing reference at McGill, virtual reference at McGill for quite some time, so over 10 years. And usually the way that the service is staffed is usually 1 hour shift is staffed by one librarian. So if we offer the service from, say, 10 to 6 p.m., each hour is staffed by one librarian. So these are our normal hours of operation during the semester. So during the summer, they're usually a bit less. So we usually provide chat, email, and text support from Monday to Friday from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. And like I said, there will usually be only one librarian on at the same time helping users. We're usually closed for chat on weekends, but since usually when the library is open, there is a librarian on site to provide reference at the desk. So while they're there to provide in-person reference, they will also go through the emails that come in over the weekend to help out the person on Monday so they don't have 20 questions to answer Monday morning. So that's usually how we've been staffing the virtual reference service, keeping in mind that usually it's combined with what we would have at the desk. So when we would have in-person reference. Now, as you can imagine, the pandemic changed a lot of that environment, right? First off, there was no longer an in-person reference desk. So in case you were wondering, McGill has several libraries and they all offer some measure of in-person reference services. That was not an option anymore. So that changed our environment and the types of questions that we were getting quite a bit. So some of the things that we optimized and changed to really offer a better service. So first off, we really focused on staffing because as you can imagine, the number of questions, especially at the beginning of the pandemic when things were uncertain, people had a lot of questions. The university announced they were closing. So we saw our volume of questions increase exponentially. So what we did is we first off increased the shifts to 2 hours because it made it easier to schedule, first of all, and also because most librarians were working from home. So it made it easier for them to manage 1 2-hour shifts as opposed to 2 1-hour shifts everywhere else in their schedule. They had to just worry about 1 2-hour block, and then they could do their work around that. Given that the number of questions was quite high, we reviewed the staffing needs and increased it to 2 to 3 librarians to offer the service at the same time. So instead of having just 1 librarian, we would have 2 to 3, so they could help each other out with questions when there were like quite a lot of them. We also tried to schedule librarians that had different expertise. So pairing, say, a humanities librarian with a science one, or agriculture librarian with a law one. So if questions from specific disciplines came in, they could help each other out in answering their questions because there was no longer a reference desk at those libraries and people couldn't go there to ask their questions. So we tried to create an environment where people could help each other out. We also added new operators. So traditionally, we would have librarians staffing the service, and we were very lucky that people really stepped up and wanted to help. So we had some head of libraries who decided to join us and help, some document technicians that are trained to offer reference at some libraries decided to help us out, some people from archives too. So people really banded together to help each other out in this new environment. And then the major thing, since again, the library was fully closed and there was no desk reference, is that we really increased our hours of operation. So in the spring, so say March to May, when the pandemic was just starting, we increased our hours instead of 10 to 5 from 10 to 6. And at the beginning, we didn't really have librarian staff weekends. Usually as the virtual reference coordinator, I would take a look on weekends and try to get to some questions. So again, they wouldn't get flooded first thing on Monday. But usually we focused on those hours, and it worked really well for the most part. In the summer, since the summer is usually our quietest time, right? Students are not on campus. Our most common users in the summer tend to be either graduate students who are working on their theses, maybe professors doing research, some community members, but it's nowhere near the volume we usually get. So we decreased those hours a little bit from 10 to 4 p.m., and that's usually our regular service offerings for the summer. So for that period, since we were anticipating a lower number of questions, we went back to our kind of regular schedule for the summer. And again, there was no service on weekends. Where it really changed is actually this fall, because continuing, the library is not open to reference. There are some services like pickup of books that people can do, and some study spaces, but there are no librarians on site providing reference. So what we did then is increase again to 10 to 6 p.m. because that worked really well in the spring term. And then we fully opened it up on weekends, so on Saturdays and Sundays, also offering virtual reference from 10 to 6 p.m. And it's been working really well for the most part. In terms of staffing, during the week, we have 3 librarians from 10 to 4, and then we'll have 2 from 4 to 6, since that end of afternoon period tends to be a little bit less busy. And on weekends, we also have 2 librarians together. So usually not one person on their own. There's at least 2. Most often they're not 3 people. And again, we try to keep that pattern of pairing some librarians of different disciplines so they could help each other out. Maybe people who were newer to providing the service with people who had a little bit more experience, so that if they had questions, they could all work together and answer questions. All right. One of the major new optimizations that we included to help people answer questions is that we really saw from the beginning that we kept getting the same questions over and over again, which you can imagine, right? It's a pandemic scenario. Most people are worried about very similar things, right? They have questions about their fines, how they can return books, if they can come on campus, if the library is open even. So especially at the beginning, we kept getting a lot of the same questions. And anytime we open a new service, so when we started providing, say, the pickup of books, so the contactless pickup of books, people were asking a lot of questions about that. When study spaces opened, people naturally also had a lot of questions about that. So what we did is created something called canned messages. In certain systems, they're also called scripts. So usually they're essentially pre-recorded, pre-written messages that people can use. So you essentially select from a list, and you have a pre-written message for, say, fines. And then it will automatically populate either the chat or the email response with that message. So people don't have to type every single time the same answer. And given that some of these were quite long, right? Like when we tried to explain that fortunately the library was closed and you can look at this page for more information, or the different scenarios relating to fines. So these were quite helpful to the operators who were providing the service, that they wouldn't have to type it out every single time. We already had some existing ones, so those traditional welcome messages, just a moment, I'm looking at your question, thank you for using the service. So we had those, but we really made the offering a lot more robust with some specific COVID-19 responses. So most likely related to the library closure. People had questions about fines and where they could return books, if they could borrow books. questions about ILL, study spaces, like all these questions that you can imagine came up in our current environment. So we really had those pre-recorded messages to make it a little bit easier for people. All right, now to number and types of questions. So this is actually quite interesting. So these are a couple of stats, not too many, just to give you a sense of how the online environment and the virtual reference service changed, especially with the library closures and the absence of an in-person reference desk. So here you see the comparison of questions that we received in 2019 versus 2020. And I really focused here on providing like only the period of the pandemic. So if you look at March, for example, last year we had just under 600 questions. And then this year we got over 800. And at that point, 800 questions was the highest number of questions we'd ever received on virtual reference. We'd never seen anything like it. The highest we'd ever seen was in the 600, maybe close to 7. But 800 questions was something that had never been seen before. And that was kind of easy to tell that it's probably because of the pandemic and people had a lot of questions. So even if we look at throughout the summer, and like the quieter months at the end of the spring, so April, May, but especially June, July, and August, you can see that we still saw an increase compared to the number of questions that we usually get. So we received a lot more, up to sometimes 200 questions more than we would normally get. But the one where we really saw an important increase was in September. So in September, we received over double the number of questions that we usually get in September. And usually these numbers stay somewhat stable from September to September. But this year, the number of questions really exploded because people had a lot of questions, and all classes were online. Some students were not necessarily in Montreal, right? We had students all over the world. So having a service that they can just reach out to pretty much at any time, at least by email, and receive an answer, well, we can see why it was probably preferred in terms of reaching us and contacting us. So that was really interesting to see the increase in the number of questions. And in some way, it also justifies the increase in staffing. So to have more people staff the service because we receive a lot more questions. And then this is the breakdown of the number of interactions that we got in March. So this is all of the interactions, so from March 1st to the end of the month, but they really, as you can imagine, started increasing a lot starting March 13. So March 13, when the pandemic was actually announced and the government announced that things were starting to shut down and quarantine was put in place. So we got 399 chats, 385 emails, and then 35 texts, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it's actually a lot for text messages. Maybe we get 10 per month usually. In this case, we got 35. So it's a really important increase in all areas of virtual reference and all the different ways to reach us. And then what I actually found really interesting is when I went back and actually looked at all of these interactions to see what they were about. So what kinds of questions were people asking? What did they want to know? So what I did is I actually went back to the beginning of the pandemic, so March 13, to see how the questions that they were asking differed from what we usually get. And there have been several different research projects done at McGill by myself and some of my colleagues that looked at those types of questions before. So we had a somewhat understanding of what people were asking in regular times, but now I really wanted to see what were they asking and were certain questions coming up more because of the pandemic. So overall, I looked at 299 chat transcripts, and I focused on chats mostly because they're the closest we can get to an in-person reference interaction, and there's some back and forth. So you actually have the option to do a reference interview to figure out what people want. By email, it can be a little bit trickier, so I really wanted something that reflected the type of interactions that we can have. It was also the type that was the most used, right? For that entire period. Chat has been used a lot more by patrons. So I went back and I looked at all of these transcripts and I assigned them each one a code. So a code based on what the interaction was about. And these are the categories that I looked at. So access, these were focused mostly on access to the library. So the physical building, study spaces, carols, that sort of thing. Circulation were mostly questions about library accounts, fines, policies, so who could access certain services, that sort of thing. Electronic resources, purchase requests. So not in March, but in the months after that, as we saw faculty adapting their syllabi to the online environment, we started seeing a lot more purchase requests for ebooks, for example. Alumni services, so a lot of our alumni contacted us asking questions because they can usually come to the library and borrow physical books. So they wanted to see what kind of service was available to them. We received some general McGill questions, so just, is the university open, for example? Some people asked for contact information, so if they wanted to contact a specific librarian, the university, a specific unit, ILL and document delivery, and then really reference questions. So trying to find items, trying to find articles, for example, for a specific assignment. So really those reference questions we typically answer. So I looked at March, and this is what I discovered. So most of the questions, perhaps not very surprisingly, were about circulation. So people were concerned about their accounts, fines. A lot of books are due at the end of the term usually. So people were really worried about, what if I have to leave the country and I can't bring back my books, for example. Then we saw a lot of questions about electronic resources, which makes sense. People were at home and had to use ebooks and databases, probably a lot more than they ever had before. And then we saw still some reference questions. So people looking for items, specific items, but also generally just trying to find books or articles on topics. And then we saw the ILL questions, so they were trying to return or get a book, purchase request, access to the library, and very few questions about policies and alumni services, for example. So really, as we could probably predict, most of the questions centered around returning books and fines a lot. So those typical circulation questions. And then what I thought would be interesting to look at is that LibAnswers actually gives us an option where we can go and search for certain keywords in all of the transcripts. So I ran a report and looked for all the times that pandemic, COVID, and coronavirus were mentioned in chat transcripts from March 13 to October 1st. And this will come to surprise to no one that so pandemic came up 88 times, COVID 324, and then coronavirus 16. So we can definitely see that this was and still is on people's minds. All right, so what are some of the next steps now that we've started optimizing the system? It was just announced not too long ago that most of the teaching for the winter will also be online. So we can expect some of the similar situations and questions to repeat and come up. So That gives you a sense of what we've done so far. So scheduling and staffing, mostly at the beginning of the pandemic. Over the semester, we added and very often changed the canned messages, right? That's something too, as the policies and the services change, we have to adapt them and change them, which requires quite a bit of work. Over the fall, so just in September, we just launched a new option that we were able to turn on in the system. So Lib Answers gives you the option to do some screen sharing when you're in chat. So you can share your screen and show people like the different steps to go to something, which, as you can imagine, is very helpful, especially if they're having issues accessing an online resource. Maybe they're not clicking in the right place or they're having a tech issue. Well, you can share your screen and show them step by step where to go. So we just launched this in September, had some training for the librarians who offer the service, and I think so far it's been used around 15 times. So maybe not the most popular feature, but it is starting to be used as people are getting used to it. And it will be interesting to see too, as questions usually in the fall will start with more regular library questions like borrowing books, access, and then as we get on to the midterms, they tend to be more about reference. So I'm anticipating we may see some more screen sharing in that term. And then for the winter term, starting probably in November, what I really want to do is start assessing all the different optimizations that we've put in place. So are the scripts, like, are people actually using the scripts? So going back and seeing if they're being used. What the breakdown that you saw for March, I actually want to expand and code all of the different chat transcripts for the entire pandemic period to see really how the questions change, and do they change according to announcements that are made, services that come up, or are they more based on the regular flow of a semester, for example? Another thing we're looking at closely too is the hours of operations and staffing. So are they enough to respond to the need that we have, or do they need to be changed? And we're looking at finding effective ways to build schedules too, to make it easier for librarians. All right, thank you so much for coming to this presentation. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. You can also email me and I'll be happy to discuss any virtual reference things with you. All right, thank you so much.